Hi.
So I'm Devin Stewart from the Carnegie Council, and I'm here with Josh Kurlantzick from
Hi, Devin. How are you?
Carnegie Endowment. Josh, today we're going to talk about your great book, Charm Offensive.
Hopefully.
How China's soft power is transforming the world. And it's been quite a week for China's soft power, hasn't it? I mean, you have this story on Manila from this morning, suspending Chinese projects due to corruption.
Well, I think the big thing is you have a lot of demonstrations in Burma, and now Carnegie and President Bush even are calling for some significant attention to Burma, and the power kind of rests with China.
Right. But so you're saying, but basically this week, China's soft power is taking a bit of a blow, wouldn't you say?
Well, I think it depends on Burma. I think China's soft power has taken a few blows in the last few months.
Right.
But there's some interesting signs on Burma specifically. Obviously they've been standing behind the Burmese government for a long time, and that's certainly not helpful. They, in the last few months, they've been kind of more aggressive. They've been a little bit more open to sort of publicly criticizing the Burmese, and I think they are really worried about that the protests in Burma are going to turn against them. The protesters, specifically made a point of marching near the Chinese embassy, and the Burma activist groups in the U.S. have targeted China. So,
right.
I think they've taken a blow. I think that they're starting to think about what this means for their international image, and then obviously the Olympics is going to be either their big capstone or their big debacle.
Right. And what are your bets on the Olympics?
Well, I think you probably can't underestimate the ability of Chinese public security people to round people up, but I think they were surprised already by how quickly the Darfur issue took fire. I think that the Chinese are gotten a lot better at dealing with the media and the governments of other countries, but they're still not real clear on what an activist group is, because they don't have a lot of real experience with that. So
right.
I think they're really taken by surprise by how quickly it spiraled into a real movement, and so they respond by this kind of half agreeing to meet with the activists and half kind of lashing out at them. But it's kind of their own fault, because they made the Olympics into such a big event that it's obviously people are going to target it.
The clock is ticking.
Yeah, literally.
Yes.
Anywhere in China you can see the clock ticking.
Absolutely. And you mentioned in your book, actually we should talk about Burma some more later, but if we get to it, because Burma is one of the case studies you mentioned in your book throughout as being a potential troubling spot of China being basically on the wrong side of history in Burma. And would you describe this current protest as explicitly pro-democracy, or is it just anti-Burmese government?
Well, I think the two things are kind of inseparable.
Sure.
I think hard to say what the original impetus was. Some people said it was because of the really horrible economic conditions. You'd think the economy in Burma couldn't get any worse, but every time I go there, it seems to be worse. It's hard to imagine, but yeah, I think it's kind of interlinked. I think the question would be kind of whether it then turns into an anti-Chinese protest. I think that their focus right now obviously is on the pretty terrible Burmese government, but people in Burma do know about Burma's relationship with China. Burma is a closed country, but people have access to some degree of independent media from outside, so they do know about China's relationship with Burma. So I think the Chinese need to be careful about their relationship with Burma in the long run. People aren't going to forget who stood behind their government.
Well, you mentioned this. It's very difficult to measure soft power.
Right.
I think some people have tried to do that. There's this interesting company, Anhalt, that I think you cited once in your book,
right,
on their Nation Brands Index. And I went to their site and checked it out, and I have the report here talking about China's brand has been decreasing as China's overall score has declined by 4% in the last 18 months. That's nearly twice the ground lost by any other country in this index. And they're seeing it as basically frantically, preparing for the Summer Olympics.
Right. Well, that's probably an accurate assessment.
Does your book need your book was published this year. Do we have to? I mean, maybe this is a chance for you to give us an update. But you do.
I think my basic point was that, first of all, if you look at the countries that are in that Anhalt brand index along with China, I mean, it's kind of surprising that China would even be where it is. I mean, most of the countries that they're going up against are countries that have a lot more, in theory, in some ways, to sell. I mean, where's the United States rank in the latest update of the Anhalt brand index?
Well, the only one I could access for free without paying $50,000 was one that put the United States on as number one.
Okay, well, that's certainly not the case now.
Uh-huh.
I don't know. I have the ones from earlier this year, and the United States was well down. I mean, the United States was well below other Western countries, too, like Australia.
What does that mean, though, brand?
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's hard to define. I mean, I think basically the brand of a nation that they're trying to define is basically kind of how a nation is perceived by other countries based on not only what George Bush or Nicolas Sarkozy do, but some combination of that and the image of their culture and the image of them as kind of benign or responsible or not, the image of average people. Obviously, it's very hard to measure.
But they use actual dollar numbers. So
they use some actual things, but I mean, I think that like some of it is as fungible as any other ranking. You know, I mean, they use surveys and studies, which we know is somewhat valuable and somewhat not.
But are they trying to imply that a brand can actually add numerical dollar amount value to products? Or?
I think they're trying to add that a brand can add numerical value to that country's economy. Right. And can add some value to their role in the world. I think that certainly has some validity. I mean, I think that when people walk into a store and they make the implicit, or let's say you walk down a street of auto dealers and you make the implicit question of kind of where you're going to buy, there is some definite branding that says that Japan has stood, at least since the early 60s, you could say, for detail and quality. And so whether that customer knows the difference between Toyota, Honda, et cetera, they know something about that quality. So it probably does add something to your economy. I think it does, at least I think you can say that if your brand is so terrible, like the U.S. and parts of the world now, it definitely detracts from your diplomacy. I don't think you can argue with that because in a lot of, we've seen like example after example where in places where people just don't like the U.S. brand right now, it's really hard to get things done. Like, you can't have a really great relationship with Turkey because average people just don't like the U.S. right now.
That's basically the point of
Right, that's basically the point. I think the hard thing is the other side is saying, well, if China's been more successful in kind of some public opinion, have they actually gotten something tangible out of that?
Right,
that's a hard question. But like in terms of China's brand declining, I mean, I think that's true in some places, but my point was just that look at who they're competing with. I mean, they're competing with a bunch of Western democracies and developed countries, and China still has a lot of quite bad and repellent things about the government and a lot of poverty. And the fact that they should even be competing with them is in some ways kind of a testament to people closing their eyes or effective public relations. Why should China be competing with Japan? Japan is a wealthy country and a democracy.
Yeah, well, Chinese people will say to you it's about time because they're 5,000 years old, which kind of makes me wonder. I mean, America is considered a new country by some, and yet it's the most preeminent country. So I don't understand this whole 5,000-year history thing.
Well, I don't know. I mean, history works both ways, right? I mean, at least until maybe the last 15 years, the U.S. benefited in the Middle East by not having been a colonial power, not having years of history, whereas France and Britain didn't. And so history has some value, but you know as well as I do that like a lot of these countries that have problems with China are those countries with the longest history. It's like Vietnam and China have a terrible relationship until recently because of history. So in some ways, I mean, it's harder for them to convince the countries that they have a long history with.
Right.
Just like for us, it would be more impressive if we could build a relationship where the Mexican government completely trusted us. But how likely is that? Because we have 200 years living next door to Mexico, and we have all sorts of disagreements go back all the way to seizing land from each other. Whereas, if we can convince the government of Botswana to have a good relationship, that might be a little bit easier.
Well, before we get right to your book, specifically, I want to go back to this problem in the Philippines, right? So Arroyo is suspending Chinese projects in the IT sector, right? Because of graft problems. I mean, and this is, we should be full disclosure. As Josh and I had the great fortune to spend about a month in 5 or 6 countries. Josh went to 6, I went to 5 this summer, and found that the way I put it, I don't want to speak for you, Josh, but the way I put it is that the things that make China different, the things that make China, worrisome for the future of the international system. Will China be shaping norms in a different way? Probably. It's inevitable. But the ways that China would be shaping things in a problematic way from an American point of view are the very things that are causing trouble for China. In other words, you can have these as you put it, no strings attached win-win business agreements or foreign direct investment from China.
Right.
But without supporting the IMF or the World Bank's initiatives to stem corruption or create sustainable business models, you will eventually find a blowback or a unhappiness from the people who actually are affected by these projects. So,
right. Well, I think
so. As you put it, and as you put it in your book, and we talked about this at the TPM Cafe debate, right? Is that these are the very things that the United States excels at, right?
Well, yeah. To some extent. I think you have basically what you have now is we spent a long time, maybe at least probably going back to 1949 when the Communist Party took over, but at least a long time where China was an important player, but we were really concerned about, the United States were really concerned about what was going on in China, all the problems they had. And we still are concerned, right? And a lot of Chinese people are concerned too. But now as China's managed this kind of feat of both beginning to become globally powerful while also still having all these same problems. And so there are good things that come from this. China has in some ways become more open, in some ways not. But the bad thing is all of these problems they had at home are now exported before they've cleaned them up at home. So we have a lot of serious questions about that, right?
Sure.
If you've been to China, anyone who's watching has been to China, you know that China's got huge environmental problems.
Absolutely.
It's just staggering, you think that Los Angeles is a problem and you should be in Beijing. And so with the problems like that and corporate governance, like Devin was talking about, and labor policies, all those problems now are going to be problems all over the world.
Sure.
And those are things the U.S. has generally done better at. I think China's had more to criticize since Bush became president, and so their crackback at us is a little easier. But it's going to be a problem for China because while they're becoming globally influential, if they're going to export all these problems to the world, at some point people are going to wonder kind of what kind of power China is.
Right. And I think sometimes the debate among the bloggers and even among that TPM Cafe debate is absolutely there's certain reasons to be sympathetic with China's emergence, and probably will take some of the burden off of the United States to be the single focus of all that's good and evil. But it's a very nuanced point that you actually also make in your book, which is there's a difference between the expediency of making a deal between governments, right? Between, for example, Burma and China, or the Philippines and China, and how the average person views it, right? So the government might prefer to do things this way, but the people might feel differently. And I guess it's a nuanced thing to talk about Burma preferring to do things this way, or North Korea preferring to do things this way. They want to work with China, blah, blah, blah. But you're actually paraphrasing the preferences of a very privileged elite.
Yeah, sure.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no. I think obviously we suffer for the same thing too. If you had a totally free vote in Pakistan, how high would the United States rank on the popularity index? Yet we continue to have a sustainable, we hope, strong relationship with President Musharraf. I think China has, in some places, China doesn't only stand behind difficult rogue regimes. I mean, they have good relationships with a lot of non-rogue regimes, South Korea, Thailand, France. And so they're a lot more adaptable than they used to be, but I think basically like what you see is that they're stepping into the places where they feel like someone comes to your neighborhood to sell goods. He's not going to want to open a store next to the giant store on the street. He wants to open a store where there's no competition.
Yeah.
And so China is like seeing that there's no competition for the relationship with Burma, or at least less competition. And so they're like, oh well, we're in there. But at a certain point, you can't only have relationships like that. And
right.
I think they're starting to recognize that. I mean, you've seen some interesting stuff in the last 6 months to a year. Them at least responding to criticism about Sudan and Burma and Zimbabwe, and them pushing North Korea.
Right.
And I think for people who question kind of what the response would be, I mean, I think the first question that we always have in the U.S. is kind of, is there anything we can do about it? And I think people don't really recognize that China is going to be a force in all these places. It's not a question of somehow stopping them. It's just a question of what our response is going to be.
But going back to the so what, right, is in a democratic setting, and I think on one hand, you could argue, I think Nye said something like this. Joseph Nye, in his book, which is right here. I brought my signed copy.
Oh, great.
It's right here. I got your book right here. We're going to do a little comparison in a minute. My Joseph Nye copy is signed, you see.
Yeah. And whereas what yours from me is not?
It is not. So it's clearly inferior. But we'll
depends on the value of a Joseph Nye signature. Right?
Right. Well, I mean,
Yeah,
I think he said something to the degree of around the area of countries that are democratic and ethical behaviors, ethical actors, have more implicit or a stock of soft power assets, right?
Right.
At the same time, they're more vulnerable, right?
Right.
Why? Because this is the point of your book, which is that leaders have to do things that are popular with the people, right? So if they're making deals with governments that are extremely unpopular, like we saw the build-up of the Iraq War, right?
Right.
So this is where the rubber meets the road, is when you're trying to conjure up alliances or economic deals or business deals or any type of thing. You have to answer to your people in a democratic setting, so it's the flip side, is
right.
You have more power, you have more soft power, but you have to answer to someone else's image.
Right, and also I think if you then make promises based on your stock of capital, you have much more to blow. I mean, I think, most people are not expecting Hu Jintao to go around the world making statements that he's promoting democracy. And so, he gets some value for the trade that China has with other countries and the aid that they provide. And the problem that you've had with the Bush administration is that, well, not that people wouldn't necessarily assume the United States would stand behind democratic activists in places, but when you go around saying, we are committed to the process of democracy in Egypt, or we're committed to opposition activists in Egypt, or to this and that, we're committed to the rule of law in Pakistan, and then you, at some point, I mean, there are real reasons why they've backed away, but at some point you back away from those promises, then people are going to say, well, where were you now? You made these promises, whereas to some extent, if you don't make any promises, I mean, I don't support that, but if you don't make any promises, like China does, when people get disillusioned, the disillusionment is going to be a lot less. And so I don't think China has a strategy to kind of take advantage of the U.S.'s problems, but they've benefited from it. I mean,
sure.
Definitely. I don't think you can doubt that.
Well, we should get to that soon, which is, you said explicitly in your book that this is not a book about the United States, but it actually is.
Okay.
Because, and you spend at least 2 chapters talking about the United States. And, look, the simple fact is the United States has created a window of opportunity by, bad policies, bad luck, paranoia after 9/11. It's created a window of opportunity for China to fill. I basically have a list here. One is and you and I talked about this in our trip The first one is the Gulf War.
The Gulf War I.
The Gulf War I, right, 1991, showed that the United States was unbeatable in traditional war. And this led...
Well, I mean, President Bush also had a coalition of allies, but yeah.
True. But just in terms of how the United States is viewed in the world.
Yeah.
And this, some countries looked at this as maybe we should think about other ways of trimming the U.S. power in international affairs. The second one, different people have different ways of trimming. I mean, you could say that radical Islamic terrorists use an untraditional, or some people say an ancient way of creating fear. Another way is that the Europeans have tried to, and sometimes out-moralize the United States. And the Chinese were investigating, as you mentioned, this concept of comprehensive national power, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
The second thing was the 1997 Asian financial crisis, and the United States sort of dragged its feet in responding. They called, the people in Southeast Asia still blame the United States, right? IMF is I am fired, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think President Clinton even recognized that. I mean, when he's looked back on several occasions, he said, I don't know if he said it in his autobiography or just said it in interviews, that he wasn't sure that he made too many mistakes, but that was one of them that he had made.
Sure. But then as you mentioned in the book, the Chinese refused to devalue their currency, and they looked magnanimous for doing so.
Right. It wasn't that big a deal.
It wasn't that exactly. They just refused to do something.
Yeah.
Right. The third thing that opened up a window is 9/11, obviously, and the Iraq War basically distracted the United States from Asia.
Well, I mean, not 9/11. I mean, I think 9/11 offered an opportunity for people around the world, well, for not everyone, but for kind of liberal-thinking people around the world to come together. It was just that opportunity after a while was squandered.
Well, I mean...
I think you could see after 9/11 that the Chinese had concerns about how quickly the United States had gotten forces into Afghanistan and had built relationships in Central Asia, and they were worried about the U.S. around them in all ways. But, I mean, it wouldn't have meant that then China would have been able to build great PR and public relations all over the world if the U.S. hadn't squandered that opportunity. The Chinese might still have been angry or worried about U.S. forces on their doorstep, but they wouldn't have been able to do anything about it if the U.S. was really popular in a lot of places. But as the U.S. popularity went down, then China gets leverage.
Sure. But
I'm just saying, I don't think it was 9/11. I think it was just the events afterwards.
Do you think it was the policies?
Yeah, I mean...
that's what risk is. I mean, it's not just the event. It's also how people make policy decisions, policy mistakes. Right. So what I mean is 9/11, Iraq War conflated into one problem.
Yeah.
And the other thing that you point out is Tiananmen Square. Now, I'd like you to talk a little bit. Explain this to me a little bit. You mentioned that Tiananmen Square actually, the net result was squashing democratic uprising or democratic movement, and the United States actually ended up looking, or U.S. culture ended up looking weaker within China. Is that what you're basically saying?
Well, sort of. What I was saying was that Tiananmen, what you have now today in China is a lot more protest, but it's a lot more diffuse, and it often tends to be by middle class people or peasants over a whole lot of issues: land rights, property rights to worship, people being thrown off their house, corrupt officials. But what you had before Tiananmen was a much more organized protest, and also around the time of Tiananmen, you had senior leaders like Zhao Jiang who could be identified as reformers. And it's very hard to have a protest movement work really well without one leader, right? If you don't have Aung San Suu Kyi or Nelson Mandela or whatever, it's really easy to kind of exist and be angry but have no focal point. So you have so many protests in China today, but they never kind of come together. Maybe the Olympics will provide that, but I personally don't think so. So you have that. Then you had a lot of people after Tiananmen, I think, as the Chinese government has become more powerful, and you have elites in some cities who've sort of become more aligned with the government because they're making money and they're doing okay, and the political pressure seems to come from rural people, poor people, and they're actually, I think, worried about the impact that those poor people are going to have protesting and coming into the cities, that you see a lot less of the kind of elite activism that you used to. That doesn't mean that academics and thinkers aren't talking about it all the time, and they are. But there was an interesting article in Time a few weeks ago called China's Me Generation about the kind of new middle class and rich in Shanghai and Beijing and other cities, and it sort of captures that point. So my point that I was making basically was that there's more protest, there's a lot more angry people. I mean, China has huge wealth inequality now. It's unbelievable.
But they're not demanding democracy.
But, well, I mean, who's demanding democracy? I mean, people would tell you that before Tiananmen started as a protest against corruption and led up to that. I mean, I think, monks are protesting in Burma about the poor way they were treated, but eventually it's going to come down to the rights and liberties that are at the base of it. But it's just, you don't have that much buy-in of, like, rich people and elites, the type of people who for better or worse, often make things happen because they know how to work the system and they know how to make change and they know how to use TV and things like that.
Sure. My friend argues, China scholar often argues that that's basically filling a philosophical vacuum right now is this consumerism. And
yeah, to some extent, yeah.
I mean, I blogged about this. The most profound quote I heard when I was in China last time, and it was quite dirty, and I got food poisoning on the first day I was there. Was in bed for 24 hours. But the most profound question I heard was, I asked this senior think tanker, what's bugging Chinese society? What's the biggest problem? And he said, a lack of ethics.
I think that's I don't know. I mean, I think it's just that you have an incredible amount of wealth that's like sloshed into the system so quickly, so little regulation that people often are unsure how people got rich. It's kind of like the United States in the 19th century, and it just leads to like not much trust in a society that already doesn't have that much trust because of years of trust being destroyed by everything going back to the Cultural Revolution and before. So I don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, I just think more like the lack of public trust is really shocking, and so people rely on their relatives and their friends, but you got to rely on more than that if you want to have a kind of stable, representative political system,
Well, I mean, it reminds me of unleashed capitalism.
Yeah, it's like, it is unleashed capitalism. It's like the Republican Party's dream.
And the sort of synergy between civil society and this animal spirits hasn't really taken place yet. It's starting. And, China's audience are several. I mean, there are several people in the audience here. There's Chinese consumers.
Right.
There are people in America and Europe and developing countries who buy Chinese goods. There are people who are affected by Chinese foreign direct investment projects. And then there's this abstract thing called the international community.
Right.
And they all are going to put different types of pressure on China to reform or bring more accountability. And
right.
I think the important point on this is that this is going to benefit Chinese people to a great degree. I mean, these food problems, these product problems. You have Mattel apologizing to a country, which
unclear. Mattel might have.
That's kind of odd. I mean, they have a toy company apologizing to a country for recalling products they sent.
Right. Unclear. I mean, I think Mattel's point of view is that they apologized to Chinese consumers and they got kind of like bamboozled into a PR situation.
Interesting.
But yeah. I mean,
But the point is the Chinese, Chinese people are going to benefit from it. I mean, there have been deaths for decades.
Yeah.
And it's this international pressure that's bringing positive change.
Yeah. Well, yeah, international pressure. I mean, there's a pretty strong movement of exposing product problems in China. But you're right that the international pressure puts more pressure on them to do something. I mean, there have been scandals going back, and there aren't like real Ralph Naderite type consumer product advocates in China, but how much strength they can have if basically no one else outside says anything about it is limited, because the U.S. is the one consuming vast amounts of the toys from China or vast amounts of the baby crabs.
Interdependence, right?
Yeah.
Well, let's get to let's put our theory hats on and talk about soft power, because
all right.
the problem with publishing these days, you have Yale. I've heard of Yale Press. They published your book.
Yeah.
People know about that, and your subtitle. It's becoming trendy to have longer and longer subtitles, right? And I think it's getting people in trouble.
Really? How does it get them in trouble?
Because you start putting you put the kitchen sink in there.
Oh, well,
then,
what's wrong with that?
Well, in your case, you say how China's soft power is transforming the world. There's only two problems with that. First of all, your book is not about soft power.
Uh-huh.
And number two is you don't talk about how it's transforming the world. I love your book, Josh, but let's talk about soft power. What you mostly talk about in your book is coercive power. Soft power, I would say, is the ability to attract rather than coerce, right? And what you've done is I sort of like to make a comparison between Said's book, Orientalism, and Sherry Prosso's book, The Asian Mystique, right? You're doing kind of the same thing. You're taking Joseph Nye's book on soft power, and you're applying this idea to a region, China, right, or a country.
Yeah.
But you're not taking the definition of soft power, which is very difficult, and some people say it's soft. That's the problem. But you're not. You're refining it. You say you might be updating it. You're making it apply to China. But let's be clear here. To get people to want what you want, right? It's like you're at a restaurant and there's someone really cool who walks in as a celebrity, and you go, "I'll have what he's having," right? It's a classic thing. And Nye talks about the primary sources of soft power are attractive and universalistic culture, consistently applied political values, and legitimate and ethical policies and institutions. Right?
Well, that was his definition.
But you want to come up with your own thing here, but you use the word soft power. That's fine.
Well, I think just because. Well, first of all, I know that he liked the book and he was.
Well, he worked it. It's right here.
So
Josh's book is.
I think just because you come up with a word and have a definition, that if people are going to use it in a somewhat legitimate way later, and it has some differences from it, I don't think that that's necessarily a failing. You have a lot of different interpretations of democracy, and as long as they fall within some spectrum, they're all, I think, legitimate. The spectrum has to end at some point.
Sure.
The Democratic People's Republic of Korea is not a democracy, but there are many different spectrums. And basically, I just tried to take. When I started the project, I was going to just use Nye straight out,
right.
And I decided I was just going to use what was referred to in Chinese journalism by Chinese thinkers. And
right.
so, rather than come up with some other definition,
right.
which actually, when I first started doing the book, we were going to call it soft influence or some other word.
Sure.
It just didn't make any sense, because if you come up with some completely different word that no one's ever heard of, first of all, then you have to spend time trying to explain that from the beginning, and people don't even have a reference point. So what I try to do is have a reference point that of the idea of attraction, but also use tools that are somewhat more coercive.
Sure.
If you just start from nowhere, I think you're already talking about a lot of sort of theoretical topics.
So what you really mean is Chinese soft power, or as how China defines it, right? Because you're really talking about their.
Yeah, we could have called it China's diplomatic influence or China's non-military influence, but I think this was a more succinct way for people to understand it. And my impression has been, although people do ask this question in talks, and that's a totally legitimate question, that people kind of get it, because normally when I talk, I kind of explain what I mean.
Right.
My general feeling about a lot of nonfiction books is that as long as the author at the beginning explains to you what he's going to do, and it makes sense, and it jives with the theory, and then he does it. Whether or not I do it is totally up to you. Then I'm willing to sign on to that. If he says, "Oh, this is what I'm going to do," and then he doesn't do it, it doesn't explain or doesn't do it, then I have a problem.
Well, you're comparing China to a lot of the times to the United States, which is fair. You also compare it to Japan, and you give Japan a pretty poor portrayal. But Nye here is saying that the sources, America is the preeminent soft power, right?
Right.
Sources of American soft power include just being the biggest economy, the largest inflow of immigrants, home to the top companies, largest exporter of films, most top global brands, the largest recipient of the Nobel Prizes in economics, physics, and chemistry, largest book publisher, and the home of the top business schools. And Japan does pretty well too. Nye says that Japan's the top soft power in Asia, with the biggest holder of patents, top aid donor, and the longest life expectancy.
Well, I think that.
But meanwhile, China appears exciting because it's coming almost from nowhere,
mm-hmm.
right?
Well, not nowhere, but yeah.
Well, it's been around for a long time, but this whole soft power game, as you said in your book, China took a different tack.
Yeah.
But when's the last time you actively sought out a Chinese brand, Josh?
Well, I think branding, they're clearly behind. I think Nye doesn't give enough credit to the value of public diplomacy and diplomacy, where I would say the Chinese are already ahead of Japan. I mean, if Japan is so successful in this, where are the results? Where is the...
People love Japanese stuff.
People love Japanese stuff.
Yeah.
But beyond that, where is the results of all the time that Japan's put in? People respect Japanese products and they respect Japanese commitment to governance, but where's the tangible payoff? Where are the people who stood up for Japan's UN Security Council seat? Where are the people who stood up for Japan in the dispute between Japan and China over submarine incursions into Japanese waters? Where are the people who stood up for Japan in trade diplomacy in Asia? I'm not disagreeing that in some ways Japan is more influential, but it doesn't seem like that's converted into tangible influence.
I think it's more of a commercial influence.
More than a commercial influence.
I think it's more in commercial influence.
More in commercial influence.
Yes. Because all the things that you're talking about are things you could say the real factor that's at play here is coercive power rather than image or soft power or how cool a country is, right?
No, I only agree with that to a certain extent. I think particularly in poorer countries in Southeast Asia, there is an appeal of China that China has developed in a way that is appealing. Japan is seen as kind of far and remote, and its development experience very different. I think that Japan's actual on-the-ground presence of Japanese people in a lot of countries, particularly in Asia, is not as great as Chinese, and also China's already realized the value of people-to-people contacts, which is going to build its soft power, which the Japanese government never really got. How much do we get? How many great things have we gotten over the years out of the Peace Corps? Which is like a relatively small program that you can't measure the benefit of the Peace Corps, but it's done immeasurable good for America's image, and the Chinese have gotten that already, and I don't think Japan's really gotten that, despite being a wealthy country for a long, long time.
And yet, we're repeatedly forgetting about it, right?
What, the Peace Corps?
We're forgetting about how these things are meaningful. Public
diplomacy.
I'm
not debating with that. I don't know that much about what the Peace Corps funding is like now, but I think generally, but I'm just saying that China seems to have pretty quickly gotten that people-to-people contacts matter, and I don't know why Japan hasn't done that.
Well, I guess we have to ask the same question of ourselves, though. Why have we cut the U.S. Information Agency, right?
Right. Well, until recently, yeah, right.
Until recently. So tell me about. Let's talk also a little bit about what it means for the United States, right? The Australian politician Kevin Rudd.
Yeah, my new friend.
Your best friend. He the biggest promoter. Met with George Bush recently and gave the president a copy of your book.
Yeah. Yeah,
that's pretty. Do you think he was trying to say something?
I'm sure the president read it cover to cover. Actually, Kevin Rudd was. I don't know the guy, but he has a long China experience, and obviously China's rise in the world is probably as important, or if not more important, for Australia, because they're sitting in the neighborhood, and China is becoming a major power in their neighborhood. China's buying a huge amount of their resources, and I think basically he was saying you got to wake up to the way that China's emerging in the world. But also, I mean, I think Australia is a good example of a place where Australia is not Burma or Zimbabwe. Australia is a place with natural cultural affinities with the United States. Australia has fought in every war for decades with the United States, and yet the United States is pretty, and not just Bush. The United States is generally not so popular there as it once was, and so we have to ask ourselves why that would be the case in a place like Australia. I mean, forget about whether the United States is popular in Zimbabwe.
Sure.
Why is the United States not popular in Australia? So I think Rudd was maybe perhaps implicitly trying to make that point too. And since, I mean, I don't follow daily polling from Australia, but my impression is that he's going to win the election there and be their next prime minister. Maybe he was hoping that Bush would also just kind of take notice of him personally and take notice that in Australia, just like in Turkey and many other places, politicians are responsive to the democratic mood, and maybe Rudd is going to be responsive and perhaps less friendly to Bush.
Well, let's talk about the next administration so we can...
The next U.S. administration.
Yeah, we can be more optimistic.
Please.
I mean, so the natural soft power asset the United States has is trying to do good for working for the global good. Right?
In theory, yes.
The Clinton Global Initiative is launching this week, and we're talking about global health, climate change. In a sense, these are the things where the United States can excel and show itself as an ethical power. And the other area is that America is an abstract idea. It's an idea. It's basically, do you love freedom? Do you love democracy? Do you embrace the Constitution? It has nothing to do with being of a certain blood or looking a certain way.
Right.
And for the long term, these two things are going to give the United States leverage vis-a-vis China in the whole soft power game. And they go back to Nye's very specific definitions of having ethical policies and having universalistic culture. So what are some of...
Well, I mean, I would say that that's only... Yes, I agree with that in theory, but in policy, theory is only good as far as, until it hits the first roadblock. And so, like I was saying before, whether it's Bush or Clinton or Obama or Giuliani or whatever, if you hold that yourself out like that and then you make mistakes, it's going to reflect worse back upon you. So yes, in theory, I think that's true, but only in theory. So if the United States doesn't live up to some of those things, and not only the United States, if any major democracy doesn't, then it'll be reflect poorly on them in a way that will be more damaging. So yeah, I agree with you in theory.
Well, what sort of natural assets does China have as a soft power? I mean,
well, I mean, I think that first of all, just the appeal of going to be and becoming the first developing country in decades. I mean, you could make the argument of what Japan or Germany was, but before the 20th century, but the first developing country in decades to be a major power has a significant appeal all over the developing world, including to people who are not necessarily natural allies of an authoritarian government. I think the second thing is that whether or not you actually think this is going to happen, China does at least portray itself as more sympathetic to other developing countries' concerns. And, I mean, I think we have to be fair and self-examine.
We're also natural competitors of developing countries.
No, I don't think that that's been proven. I mean, I think that China is only directly competitive with a certain number of countries that manufacture certain types of goods. China is not competitive with African countries or resource-rich Latin American countries or resource-rich Central Asian countries or the Middle East.
Well, that's not true. I mean, there was this big scandal about Chinese making African traditional clothing.
Yeah, I mean, there are stories, but if you actually look at significant studies of the overlap, like the World Bank's study of China and India's investment in Africa, China's export profile is not that similar to Africa. And African countries that have been kind of written off, their economies written off, like Zambia. There are a lot of problems with Chinese investment in Zambia, but China's massive demand for commodities is reviving a lot of those economies. I'm not a huge fan of China, but I don't think you can deny that.
Do you eat Chinese food?
Yeah, why? It's not my favorite, but it's no Thai food.
Is Thai food your favorite?
Yeah.
So,
but no, just to go back to that, and I think also that if you could demonstrate that you're emerging in this way, and you're going to stand up for all these countries in some way at the WTO, at the UN, even people who are democratic-minded in a lot of developing countries would have a lot of good feeling toward China. And maybe that's partly because they have a lot of bad feeling now for the U.S., but I think that just in general, that demand is there for that type of other power.
Well, you mentioned actually 3 concrete risks of increasing Chinese power in general and using soft power. One is a more isolated Taiwan. Mm-hmm. 2 is global competition for oil, and the United States and China could butt heads on this. And competition over countries that some people call are in play, mm-hmm. but the interesting ones are the ones that you cite that are deemed by the Freedom House as not free. Iran, Uzbekistan, and Sudan.
Yeah, but I think there are other countries in that spectrum, like that, where the U.S. relationship has declined a lot. What's that?
Venezuela?
Right, no, I'm just saying not only in the book. I mean, I think the U.S.'s relationship with South Korea has really deteriorated a lot, and the U.S. is...
But the Pentagon, of course, wants to avoid at all costs, or not all costs, but wants to avoid as much as possible making a choice between the United States and China.
Making who would have a choice?
Making it ever a choice in the world. I mean,
from right.
other countries'
right.
perspective. Do you ever? I guess we should get to the so what part of this. And
well, I mean, I think that to some extent the Chinese would like countries to not make a choice if it means that they're going to lose out in that choice. I mean, I don't know if that's the Pentagon stated position, that's fine. I don't know that if you put it to them, well, would you rather have important countries not choosing or just choosing the U.S., I'm not sure that they would, throw that away. But I mean, I do think there'll be a day that'll come at some point where some of these countries will have to choose. I mean, but that's like crystal ball gazing.
Well, okay. So for the final thing here, let's construct an imaginary time machine for 50 years in the future. And
yeah.
China's soft power is very strong.
Or just China itself is very strong.
China's it's successful. Successful project. It does the Olympics successfully.
Right.
We were debating the World Without the West debate, you and I, and Steve Weber over there
right.
at the TPM, and then over at National Interest. Right. They have an online presence as well.
Right.
And the World Without the West is happening in some ways, partly because of globalization.
Right.
Globalization creates an opportunity to diversify your economic relationships.
Yeah.
Right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that people are creating a separate bloc altogether. Now, a world without the West could actually be very beneficial to the United States. I mean, the thesis that countries are, or let's put it this way, as Brent Scowcroft says, the United States is becoming more dispensable, less indispensable. Mm-hmm. Right? There's an upside to that.
Yeah.
The upside is the United States isn't the big fat target that everyone wants to pull down.
I think if you told most average Americans or even some policymakers, I agree with that. I mean, I think China gains a lot from not having a big fat target. But if you threw that curve at a lot of Americans and said, I mean, this must just be our psyche. You say, well, we're going to be much more dispensable in the future, but the benefit will be people will be talking less about us and sometimes be less angry about us. I'm not sure that most people would make that trade.
Well, China.
I agree that would have some benefits for us, but I'm not sure that that's. I mean, maybe people would just accept that, but I don't know. I'm not sure.
What's a happy future for China and the United States to get along?
Let me just go back to that for a second. I mean, it's been a long time, right? 60, 70 years. I mean, even before the Second World War, the United States was the most powerful country in the world, despite the fact that the sun never set on the British Empire. Who in the United States today remembers a time when things were not like that? In your 90s, in your 100s? And so I think it's really hard to disabuse people of the notion that the United States might be dispensable in some way. So I'm just saying that's a hard notion to get through people. I think they would have some benefits, definitely. A happy world would be one in which I think the U.S. maintains the type of military lead that both reassures other countries, as long as China is still an authoritarian country, and prevents any conflict, God forbid, but the U.S. in a way acts like Britain did in the 30s and 40s and 50s,
Sure.
or even before that in the 19th century, and sort of allows China to take the type of power that is probably inevitable, whether you like it or not. And then we hope that the Chinese government is up to that task and also changes.
And the U.S. managing its own, and also increasing its own soft power would probably
right.
help that. I mean, you
You
mentioned.
I mean, that doesn't mean like I think I talk about this in the book or maybe somewhere else. Just because you're embracing someone doesn't mean that you can't keep your hand behind the back with a gun in it. I don't think anyone would say that the Chinese government, while also embarking on this, and I certainly wouldn't, hasn't also been building up its military spending. So,
right. So that's
you
what
can't. It doesn't mean that the Pentagon's going to sail home and close up shop.
Well, this is what CSIS is calling smart power. So maybe
power.
Maybe you should have called.
Well, they already branded that.
Well, and I think that CSIS. I'm an adjunct fellow there, by the way. Very happy to see that they're embracing smart power.
Good.
I think it's a good sign. Because,
better than dumb power.
That's for sure, and it definitely shows that it's becoming, I think, more of an issue, mainstream issue in Washington, and perhaps something that future administrations.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, I think we had this situation a few years ago where Don Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, basically said he didn't know what any of these things were, and he was unclear that they had any relevance. So, I think the fact that people are thinking about it means that at least it's getting through to some people.
Well, Josh, I think we covered all our bases today.
All right.
Right?
Yeah, well, hopefully.
Thanks a lot, Josh.
Thanks so much, Devin.